I'm Ken Ito, the Director of the Center for Japanese Studies here at the University of Michigan, and I'll be moderating the panel today. Thank you for coming. We're starting to learn some of the grim statistics of the earthquake and the tsunami that struck northeastern Japan on March the 11th. We know that tens of thousands of people died, and that over 440,000 people have been displaced. We've also seen the heart-rending images of destruction, and we've followed uneasily the developments of the nuclear power plants in Fukushima. The events still unfold, and no full understanding nor closure is possible now. But our panel has been planned as an effort to provide some frameworks toward understanding the staggering events. I'd like to ask Lester Montz, Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, to open this panel on behalf of the University of Michigan.
Good afternoon. And thank you, Professor Ito. I'm pleased to welcome those of you who are gathered here at the Michigan League, as well as those who are joining us via the websites. I want to thank Professor Ito and his staff for organizing this event. And thanks to the members of the panel for finding time to be here to share their thoughts. We have tremendous expertise at the University of Michigan to analyze the earthquake, the effects of the tsunami, and the current conditions at the nuclear power plant site. Just this morning, Professor Gary Waz from the Nuclear Engineering Department was on the Today Show offering his perspective on the nuclear power plant failures and explosions near Fukushima. You know where I'm talking about. The catastrophic nature of the situation in Japan creates a strange juxtaposition between our human species and the power of nature, and our ability to cope and seek understanding. All of us share a deep concern for the thousands of people whose lives will be forever changed by the events of the last week. We're eager for the facts about Japan's world-shaking catastrophe, and today's speakers will help us meet that need. There is much to learn. How are the survivors coping? How are emergency medical units providing care? How has Japan's history prepared the nation for this terrible hour? How will the crisis at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant be contained? At the same time, we know that the losses along the Pacific coast of Japan are beyond our understanding. The waves of grief that followed the quake and tsunami have reached as far as this landlocked university. Please stand and join me in a few minutes of silence in respect for those who lost their lives and in sympathy for all who've been displaced. Please join me. Thank you. The Michigan community spans the globe, but at times like this, we are particularly aware of its reach. We were in almost immediate contact with current students who are studying in Japan, and scholars and researchers across the campus reached out to their colleagues in Japan. Our thoughts were also with alumni and their families who were living in Sendai and other wards and prefectures in northeast Japan. In the coming months, I expect there will be many opportunities for our University of Michigan community to express its concern in useful ways. So thank you for being here today. This is a positive way to begin our search for understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Lester. I'll be introducing the panelists as we proceed. Our speakers today have agreed to comment in relation to unfolding events. This is a difficult task, but one to which they bring the perspective of their respective disciplines. I thank them for speaking today in the public interest. They represent the spirit of the university, where thought is brought to bear on what is most difficult to comprehend. I'll ask the speakers today to make a series of short presentations, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Today's panel is being live streamed on video. I thank those watching today from other locations. In order to accommodate live streaming and to record questions as they occur, I'd like to ask the audience to write their questions on the 3x5 cards that have been distributed. Please indicate the name of the panelist to which the question is addressed. We'll be collecting the 3x5 cards as the panel proceeds, and I'll be reading them out to the panelists once the presentations conclude. Our first panelist is Dr. Masid Abir. She's a fellow in the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program and a clinical lecturer in emergency medicine here at the university. Dr. Abir researches disaster medicine and preparedness. She studies healthcare needs and delivery in the acute phase of mass disasters.
Good afternoon. Dr. Ito, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel today and speak to you all. The disaster in Japan can be best described as a confluence of both natural and man-made disasters. On March 11th, around noon, a 9.0 earthquake struck off of the northeast coast of Japan, and an hour later resulted in a tsunami with a 30-foot wall of water hitting the northeast coasts and water coming into the coast up to 6 to 7 miles. About 8 p.m. on the same day, the Japanese government announced an emergency in the nuclear plant in Fukushima. As a result of the damages done to the Tokyo Electric and Power Company, power supplies to the power plant had been decreased, and subsequently the cooling systems at the power plant had been compromised. As with any earthquake and tsunami, the most pressing need and pressing issue in the immediate phase of the disaster is search and rescue, and this is a time-sensitive matter. Unlike other earthquakes, for example Haiti, that happened in the summer months and was not followed by a tsunami, the cold temperatures of the water and the cold winter temperatures were also an additional risk to any survivors from the immediate earthquake. The death toll, as of the last numbers, exceeds 14,000, and the missing numbers are in excess of 13,000. In this situation, there are unique challenges to delivery of healthcare in this specific disaster zone. Expected patterns of injury in an earthquake are usually blunt trauma to the head, neck, chest, and abdomen. In the absence of the tsunami, the survival of individuals under the rubble is directly proportional to the time under rubble, and long-term morbidity is also predicted by time under rubble. In this situation, again, the fact of the falling tsunami resulting in undoubtedly drownings and also deaths and additional morbidity due to hypothermia can be predicted. Challenges to healthcare delivery are actually very similar to some challenges that we faced during Katrina. The two major hospitals in the northeastern regions one particular university hospital in Sinai essentially had to take care of patients for days without enough water supply, food supply, in some cases without electricity. There are reports that medications in these hospitals and pain medications were in extreme short supply. And healthcare providers in these hospitals had to function under very unusual circumstances. Not only did they have the continued fears of aftershocks after the earthquake, the continued concerns for the nuclear and radiation exposure, they also, in many instances, there are reports that they had no idea where their family members were and where their loved ones were. So you can imagine the kind of stress that these healthcare providers are under. There are about close to 500,000 individuals who have been displaced as a result of this disaster, and 22 shelters across Japan are accommodating these displaced individuals. Food and water in the immediate week after the disaster were in extreme shortage, and as of Thursday, the major highway leading to this northeastern region and Sinai has been repaired, allowing for emergency services to deliver food and water, and also the airport at Sinai is functional and allowing for relief missions and helicopters and airplanes to arrive. Medications have been in short supply, whether in makeshift hospitals that have been made in schools and other unconventional settings to provide health care, and also in major hospitals across that region. We're talking about a country whose quarter of the population is over the age of 65, so this is an old population. In general, during disasters, there are two populations that are very, very sensitive to basically the turmoil of the setting. One is the very young and the other is very old. And the very old have very unique challenges that they face. You can imagine that a younger individual can maybe last days, if not weeks, perhaps comfortably, relatively speaking, in a shelter, as opposed to an elderly individual who may have already diseases and illnesses and will not be doing well with the discomforts of a setting that they're not familiar with, not having access to their medications. And in fact, during this disaster, as with Katrina, one of the major challenges was with individuals who have chronic illnesses, individuals don't know what medications they're on. If they know their medications, they don't know what doses they're on, and they've never had time to really collect their medications to bring with them when the disaster happened. And that's a major challenge that Japan is also facing. As with any other massive disaster, the identification of the deceased is a major challenge, and Japan is no exception in this case. Unfortunately, due to a lack of supply of fuel, many of the individuals or deceased have not been able to get cremated, and the local government has approved burials for these individuals. So this is, as we all know, an ongoing disaster. The nuclear plants, and I'm sure the experts will comment on after my talk, have yet to be cooled, and there are many different reports of higher levels of radiation being emitted from these sites. And the health consequences, most recent reports of basically detecting radiation in spinach, in milk, and in tap water are concerning. However, many authorities, including the World Health Organization, do not believe that the levels detected in food can have any serious long-term consequences for individuals. So what kind of challenges are we forecasting? As I mentioned a second ago, the health consequences. It so happens that the reports are that the hospitals, local hospitals in the area, did not get a massive surge in patients from this incident, which is actually alarming because that tells you that is an indicator of a number of people who survived or may not have survived. And again, the fact that this earthquake was followed by a tsunami certainly did not help matters. And the health consequences of radiation exposure and environmental, basically, levels of radiation in the environment, including the food that I just mentioned, is yet to be determined. Economic implications are far-reaching. Already effects on the Nikkei they are pretty pronounced. And the long-term economic consequences, just taking examples of other disasters in other regions of the world, anyone can just guess how much damage has been done. And the psychological impact, disasters, even in the setting of the most resilient of cultures, can have profound effects on individuals and communities. And For example, post-traumatic stress disorder in Haiti and in Katrina were profound, and the pediatric population is particularly susceptible to this. As of now, the plans are to basically send people from that region for the next 6 months to a year to different parts of Japan until temporary housing is built. And all the psychological stresses of displacement are yet to be seen. The US and international community have already played a significant role in disaster relief. The US has pledged $35 million of monetary aid, and hundreds of search and rescue teams have been deployed to the area, and the US military has had an active role in search and rescue, which is now, as of Thursday, really a relief effort. And a team of nuclear experts have also been committed to help Japan in the cooling of the reactors. And other international groups, including but not limited to the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders, are also active. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Babir. Our second speaker is Philip Brown, who comes to us from the History Department at The Ohio State University. Professor Brown is an expert in early modern Japanese history. He's currently studying civil engineering, state modernization, and flood control in 19th and 20th century Japan. This project focuses on coping with natural disasters and provides a historical perspective on responses to catastrophes in Japan.
Thank you very much, Professor Ito, and I want to say thank you to not only Professor Ito, but to Jane Ozanek and all the staff who've been so helpful in supporting this panel. I'd like to talk a little bit today from a perspective that's broader than just earthquakes. I'm particularly interested in providing some kinds of background that will emphasize some of the reasons why Japan has the high degree of preparedness that people have commented on. I in particular want to emphasize, despite the comments we've just heard and all of the problems that are clearly there in terms of recovering from this disaster, the degree to which historically Japan has been highly resilient in dealing with issues of this sort. But I also want to add a brief note of caution about how people have dealt with these and what these kinds of disasters and what the effects of some of our solutions are. To that end, I want to talk a little bit more about this issue of resilience, not so much by talking about recovery activities, but by going through a list of examples in just one area that have suffered over time, the area where I'm doing most of my work. All of that indicates the degree to which Japan routinely faces high natural hazard risks, and these are, of course, associated with earthquakes, but far more than earthquakes, floods and landslides are particularly common, and these also are outcomes of earthquakes or related to earthquakes in various ways, so it's not entirely off subject, but it also provides a practice ground or a stimulus to take the issue of natural hazard threats seriously. And finally, I want to look a little bit at some of the pre-nuclear but still man-influenced and man-made impacts on natural hazards. We tend to think of the nuclear issue in this particular incident as being unique, and in some ways it certainly is. But people in past times have faced other events and other problems that they similarly thought of as unique, and we should at least recognize that this current situation has some broad parallels. I will do this by talking primarily about examples from Niigata Prefecture, the main area where I do my research. Niigata is in this area here. Oops, I want to do that. It's this area here, which is directly across the coast from where the current tsunami hit. I'm going to talk in particular about Niigata City, Nagaoka City, and Kashiwazaki, and an area just north of Nagaoka, to give you several examples here. The first example I want to talk about is the Niigata earthquake of 1964. This was a magnitude 7.5 on the Japanese scale, not as big as the most recent one, but certainly damaging. As you can see in the little map over here, the epicenter was off the coast of Niigata. So what Niigata got was a tsunami just like what we were talking about in Tohoku. But in addition, it got the other thing that people most fear from earthquakes, and that is fire. In this case, an oil refinery that's up in smoke. The damage here is clearly evident, not only in terms of these films, but the tsunami that came in this case, came well inland. People had to flee from it, but since this is a very broad, flat area, you don't get the depth and quite the force of the tsunami that we see in Tohoku. And it took weeks for this water to drain back out. This is going to be a problem in Tohoku, many parts of Tohoku as well. This was followed a few weeks later by major floods that continued to exacerbate this particular problem. Jumping ahead a little bit, in the summer of 2004, major areas around Nagaoka were flooded badly. This is an area where floods are common, even in contemporary era. But literally 3 months later, another large earthquake struck this area, causing landslides, creating dams that blocked streams and created additional problems with floods, and suffered fairly heavy loss of lives and damage. Third earthquake that took place here was less than 2 years later. Nagaoka is here, about 12 kilometers away is the area of Kashiwazaki. This occurred in, again, July of 2007. In this case, there was no particular flood, but the damage to areas that people had thought were safe up on sand dunes, which had a Niigata earthquake, survived quite well, actually all collapsed, and there was liquefaction involved here. The most distinguishing characteristic of this area is that this is the first earthquake that actually generates radiation leaks. There's no tsunami here, but there were radiation leaks of a small sort. And that still created problems here. So the structure of nuclear plant facilities began to come under question again because of this particular development. Now, I want to go back and talk a little bit more about floods, because these are actually a far more widespread problem, and in some ways they create damage as great as tsunami, at least in the area that I'm looking at. In 1898 and 96, there was a large break along the Shinano River, which is Japan's longest river, that flooded an area I'll show you on the map in a moment, but it also also flooded areas well down to Niigata. It promoted the development of the so-called Okotsu diversion channel. That construction started in 1909 and was completed in 1922, at the time the largest single civil engineering project in East Asia. The area where it was built is here. The modern map shows the diversion channel actually being larger than the Shinano River, which runs down here. The Yokoto break occurred about here, and all of this area pretty much down to the city of Niigata got flooded as a result of this. That's more damage than the tsunami in the 1964 earthquake. In building the diversion channel, a variety of weirs were set up. After 5 years of construction, this particular weir, through hydrological forces, was undermined and it collapsed, and it created a second problem. Not a flood this time. All of the waters of the Shinano just went out the diversion channel. But what that meant was, practically speaking, this whole area from the diversion channel down to Niigata was without water. This area is low enough so that when you get when you remove the flow of the Shinano River, seawater flows back up into this area, making all of the land contaminated with salt. industrial waste from the city and human waste from the city populations. There were, as a result of this, calls to abandon the diversionary channel process, just as there are going to be calls to abandon nuclear power plants. In this particular case, they redesigned it. The repairs were completed in 1931, and it continues to function to this day. I focused a lot on floods in Niigata, not just because Niigata has a lot of them, but because, according to the World Commission on Dams, on large dams, more than 50% of the Japanese population at any given time is subject to the potential of flooding. If you want to talk about being on a precipice and something that creates a sense of an awareness of a need to be prepared for emergencies, this is certainly one of those factors. But in addition to that, landslides are a critical issue. In Niigata Prefecture alone, from 1950 to 2003, there were more than 4,600 landslides. And that's one prefecture, the equivalent of one state. It heightens people's awareness, and it makes people pay attention to what needs to be done to prepare for these disasters. So if we talk about the high level of preparation, it's these kinds of ongoing phenomenon, as well as frequency of earthquakes, that creates a sense of awareness. In dealing with this, there have been a number of civil engineering projects, and I just want to illustrate briefly with a picture here from the mouth of the Shinano River. The old river followed these red lines, and you can see it's been considerably narrowed with dikes today. Population has increased a great deal in this area. This area is now a high fashion district of sorts, but this has not come without a cost. We are seeing some safety improvements here. The number of people who die from floods and wind damage is clearly going down. The area of residential land that's affected is clearly going down, but the actual capital losses are going up, and if you look at the losses per acre, they are rising much more dramatically. Part of the reason for this is that when people move into these areas, they take more water out of the soil, and they get, through a variety of devices, an increased subsidence. This is just 1 year's subsidence, and we're getting up to 20 millimeters of subsidence of land at any given time. This is not unusual. New Orleans suffers from the same thing. It's the same problem. But what it means, again, like New Orleans, is that large parts of Niigata City are in fact now below sea level, all of these blue and green areas, which means the next time there's a tsunami or the next time there's a flood, more areas are going to be affected, and the damage is going to be higher because the value of the land has gone up and there's been more building here, and the water is not going to be able to flow back out again, creating the same problems of stagnation and health risks that go along with that. So all of this, despite increased improvements in architecture, means that we're going to have increased potential for tsunami damage and flood risk here. So again, what I want to suggest here is that the frequency of challenges historically, both earthquake and non-earthquake challenges, encourage people to have a sense of urgency, to put more effort into planning, to practice, to run through drills on a common basis, and all of that contributes long-term to the resilience of Japanese society in the face of these disasters. Japan's pre-nuclear man-made adverse impacts are each terrible in their own context. They raise some of the same issues we talk about now with the nuclear device, and they may be useful reference for us to think about as we try to reflect on where we go from here. But as my last cases mention, these all indicate a need for some degree of caution as well. Our solutions themselves generate new problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brown. Our third speaker today is Ryoko Kage, who teaches political science at the University of Tokyo. Professor Kage is currently Toyota Visiting Professor at our Center for Japanese Studies. Her research focuses on Japanese civil society in the aftermath of World War II, part of her work focuses on the reconstruction of Japan in the post-war period, and she'll be speaking today on the insights regarding reconstruction that might be gained from examining prior moments of destruction.
Hello. Today I will be speaking, building, as Professor Ito has mentioned, building on the insights based on my research on post-war reconstruction in Japan, trying to build on those insights to compare the recovery of Kobe from the earthquake in 1995 and what those might tell us about the prospects for reconstruction in the Tohoku region in the wake of this current earthquake. So just a very, very quick overview of the geographical area where these areas are located. Kobe in central Japan, January of 1995 was the earthquake. Sendai, the Tohoku area earlier this month, encompassing a much larger region. Also, a very quick overview comparing these two disasters. These are probably figures you're already very familiar with already, so I will just skip through this.
She can't hear.
Oh. Sorry. Okay. These are probably figures that you are already familiar with, so I am going to skip over to the recovery figures from Kobe. And in the case of Kobe, the recovery in the physical infrastructure was relatively swift. The electricity infrastructure was fully restored pretty much in 1 week, with the exception of houses that were completely destroyed. By January 23rd, 1 week after the earthquake, electricity was restored. By the end of the month, the telephone networks were restored. Gas was restored by mid-April, as was the water infrastructure and the sewer infrastructure. The railroad and highway systems took a little bit longer to recover. The railroad system was fully operating by August of the same year, but the highway system took until the following year, August of the following year. So that needed a bit more time. And the infrastructure, of course, is crucially important for recovery in other parts of the Kobe region as well, such as population. In the first year after the earthquake, Kobe lost roughly 6.5% of the population, or roughly about 100,000 people. Most of this was not so much due to the deaths from the earthquake as to people fleeing the area to move to neighboring cities such as Osaka. But after that, as you will see, the population does begin a relatively swift recovery, although it was very gradual. And right around 2004, the population was recovered to pre-earthquake levels. So 8 years or 9 years until population recovers. In terms of housing is an especially important measure of post-disaster recovery because we know from scholars who have been studying the post-disaster reconstruction of Kobe that in terms of the disaster survivors' psychological well-being, being able to move out of temporary shelters and into more permanent housing really affects the sense of reconstruction among their survivors, their psychological sense of well-being. And the figures on housing are available every 5 years. As of 1998, 3 years after the earthquake, these are different parts of the city of Kobe, Higashinaraku, Naraku, Chuoku, etc. 3 years after the earthquake, all of the different neighborhoods in Kobe are still seeing reduced levels of housing stock. As of 2003, 8 years after the earthquake, most parts of Kobe are seeing larger housing stock compared to the pre-earthquake era, with the exception of Nagataku, which is still lagging behind pre-earthquake levels. And even as of 2008, 13 years after the earthquake, the housing stock in Nagataku is still below pre-earthquake levels, while in other parts of Kobe, the reconstruction has proceeded at a much higher pace. So recovery has proceeded, but also with variation across different parts of the disaster-affected areas. And Nagataku certainly suffered the highest levels of damage in the Kobe area. In terms of tourism, both Kobe and the Tohoku area that was just affected by the earthquake rely heavily on tourism, and tourism seems to recover more quickly than some of the other infrastructural or housing-related measures. During the first year after the earthquake, the number of tourists visiting Kobe was cut in by 1/2, falling from just over 20 million people a year to about 10 million people a year. But thereafter, the recovery is quite swift, and by 1998, the number of tourists has recovered to pre-disaster levels. And based on my research on post-war reconstruction in Japan from World War II, I have identified 3 main factors that seem to drive a society's ability to recover from disasters, and the 3 are economic resources, state assistance, and social networks. And these 3 factors are not only relevant for post-war recovery, but they're also factors that scholars who have been looking at post-natural disaster reconstruction have identified to be important. Scholars such as Daniel Aldrich, who has been studying the recovery of Kobe in the wake of the Kobe earthquake, or the recovery of Tokyo in the wake of the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, have also identified these factors to be crucial, as well as Professor Shigeo Tatsuki at Doshishu University, who's been tracking the recovery of Kobe as well. And so how can we compare Kobe and Tohoku in terms of how well endowed these 2 regions are in terms of these 3 factors? And to begin first with economic resources, we know that the Tohoku region has long been known to be one of the poorest areas of Japan, and this shows per capita income levels. Comparing Kobe as of 1995 against the Tohoku region today. And as you will see, in terms of per capita income levels, the Tohoku region lags well behind the Kobe area, and in fact most of the region is much poorer than the national average, which greatly constrains the resources that they can dedicate to the task of reconstruction. And just to identify some of the areas on the map, just the Iwate, Miyagi, Fukushima prefectures, the areas on the Pacific coast that have been most affected. In addition to the fact that this is a much poorer area than the Kobe area, the government's ability to respond to this destruction is much more constrained today than it was 15 years ago. And as we know, the Japanese government has the largest fiscal debt among the developed industrialized countries. And outstanding central government debt as a percentage of GDP has tripled in the last 15 years, which really constrains the amount of resources that they can mobilize towards the task of reconstruction. And this is also true of local governments as well. Hyogo is the prefecture in which Kobe is located, and comparing Hyogo prefecture's government debt levels against debt levels that are seen in the Tohoku prefectures, Hyogo was in much better shape when the earthquake occurred compared to the regions that were hit earlier this month. The political context surrounding the Kobe earthquake and what it is today are quite different, although it is not entirely clear yet how this difference will play out. In 1995, Japan had a coalition government consisting of three parties: the Liberal Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Party, and Sakigake. Whereas today we have a single party in power, the Democratic Party in Japan, but this party does not have a majority in the upper house, which may constrain their efforts at reconstruction. But the LDP has also, which is the main opposition party, has also agreed to all of the reconstruction-related bills that the DPJ will be submitting to the parliament. So it's not clear how this difference will play out over the next few months. In terms of social networks can be expected to be especially important in helping in areas post-disaster recovery, especially when economic resources are constrained. Citizens can look out for each other, they can disseminate information amongst each other, they can coordinate various tasks and try to solve various problems on their own. So dense social networks can greatly accelerate a community's post-disaster reconstruction. But unfortunately, in terms of this measure as well, the Tohoku region is much more limited compared to what the Kobe area had when it was hit by the earthquake. And one reason for this is just the fact that that the Tohoku region is much more spread out compared to the Kobe area. And so in terms of population density, the Hyogo area was much more densely populated compared to the Tohoku areas. And this also has led to disaster victims being located in much more, they are much more spread out compared to the situation in the wake of the Kobe earthquake. In the wake of the Kobe earthquake, there were just over 200,000 people living in just over 1,000 shelters. In the case of Tohoku today, there are more than 2,000 shelters. So just the relief and providing the rescue and the food, water, etc., is much more of a greater logistical effort. Another factor that leads to the thinner social networks in the Tohoku area is just the fact that this is a very old, much more aging population than what Kobe was in 1995. And in terms of the percentage of the population that is over 65, much of the population has an elderly population that is over 20%, more like 25, 30%. So there are many people who need care and assistance, fewer people who are able to contribute to the reconstruction efforts. So this may be expected to slow down the reconstruction efforts as well. Another indicator of the thinner social ties that are prevalent in the Tohoku areas, the percentage of single-member households is also higher in the Tohoku area compared to Kobe. And as a percentage of the population, these prefectures are well over 20% in terms of single-member households, whereas the Hyogo prefecture, where Kobe was located, was only at roughly 16%. And an indication of the more atomized nature of the communities in the Tohoku area, the government of Japan conducts a survey every 5 years asking respondents, well, how much time do you spend on informal socializing every day? And this is in minutes per day, average number of minutes per day. And the residents of Hyogo prefecture tended to spend much more time on informal socializing compared to Miyagi, Iwate, or Fukushima in the Tohoku regions. So much thinner avenues of communication among the citizens. These people are much more atomized than people were in Kobe. So all of this paints a very bleak picture for as far as prospects for reconstruction go in the Tohoku area. This is a much less wealthy part of Japan, at a time when government resources for responding to this kind of crisis is much more constrained. And in addition, the social networks that could be expected to compensate for the lack of, for the relative shortage of resources are also more lacking in this area. However, all is not cause for despair, and there are things that we have learned since the Kobe earthquake, and just the fact that this earthquake has occurred after the Kobe earthquake allows us to draw on the lessons from the Kobe earthquake and to build on those legacies to start the reconstruction effort. And I can point to two of those legacies. The first is the much more extensive network of disaster relief-related nonprofit organizations that are in place today in Japan compared to 15 years ago. And many people point to the Kobe earthquake as a watershed for nonprofit and voluntary activities in Japan. And these groups have been growing and accumulating experience in disaster relief over the last 15 years. And these groups can be expected to contribute to the effort. And in addition, the government, in addition to nonprofit organizations, the government, businesses, citizens have accumulated a lot of information since Kobe. And it really is not just the Kobe earthquake, but there have been a series of large-scale earthquakes that have taken place in Kobe without causing so much human casualties. But those in the Chuetsu area that Professor Brown pointed to, the Noto Peninsula earthquake of 2007, which also registered as 6.9. And through dealing with these disasters, the government, businesses, and the nonprofit sector have really accumulated a lot of experience and knowledge about how better to deal with these kinds of situations, which should help them to address the situation in a much more efficient manner compared to the post-Kobe situation. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rieko. Our next speaker is William Martin, who teaches in our Department of Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences. He specializes in the development of computational methods related to neutron transport, reactor core analysis, and reactor thermodynamics. Professor Martin is involved in a research project to create a virtual reactor at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which would enable more enhanced testing of nuclear reactors.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to try to look at my slides and you instead of the screen, if I can. So which way? Okay. And try to give you, this is going to be some facts that we know that happened. I'm going to go through this very quickly because these overheads, I guess, will be posted on the website. And so I want to go through what we know, what we all know pretty quickly, and then get to some of the areas that we don't really know, that we have to use judgment, and where the media, where you're seeing things that you're hearing things and possible scenarios and worst case and so on, and what do you believe? Well, we don't know. What we can do is give you our best judgment as to what we think is going on. So I'd like to spend a little more time on that. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. A brief description, comparison to 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, 2 accidents we've had in the past. The current status, and my thoughts and the thoughts of my colleagues on where it will go. What's the likely path? And what's maybe a worst case credible path that this may go? So the reactors at Fukushima, there are 10 reactors of the 55 in Japan. You can see the epicenter here. Here is Fukushima Daiichi. And so just west of the epicenter is Fukushima Daiichi, and then Fukushima Daini. There are 10 reactors at this site, 6 at the one that we're worried about. The other 4 at the other site all shut down as they should have. There were some early reports of damage at Onagawa, which then have been resolved because we haven't heard anything more about it. and nothing I've seen about Tokai. So we are focused on Fukushima Daiichi. There are 6 units there. 3 were operating and 3 were shut down. This is the really the key drawing. This is a very large. Oops, wrong button. This is a very large facility. The fuel is about 12 feet long, and it's only about this piece of it here. This whole thing is probably 100 foot tall or so. The spent fuel pool is here, which we're worried about that. The core is inside this pressure vessel that's also inside of another primary containment, which is several feet thick of reinforced concrete. We're now pumping seawater into the core, trying to keep it cool. And on Unit 4 and possibly Unit 3, there's some issues with the spent fuel storage pit, because this building basically has been destroyed, the top of it, and this spent fuel pit is open to the atmosphere in Unit 4. At least not directly, but through a large hole in the roof. So the sequence of events, there was the status, the 6 reactors, 3 were operating, 3 were shut down. The 9.0 earthquake caused the reactors to shut down. The 3 reactors to shut down, they shut down immediately. That means no fission power. It's only decay heat now. It's sort of like nuclear charcoal in the sense that the charcoal is hot and it will decay, it will lose its heat, but over a period of decades for nuclear fuel as opposed to charcoal. So that charcoal has to cool off. These reactors are only designed to handle an 8.2 earthquake, and they shut down fine. It was the tsunami 55 minutes later. It was a 30-foot tsunami. The seawall around these reactors is designed to withstand a 20-foot tsunami. It basically wiped out all of the off-site and on-site power because they lost all of their diesel generators. There's the switchgear, which actually was a very important part because they brought in new diesel generators almost immediately. They airdropped a whole bunch of them. They had no place to hook them up. The switchgear was gone. And fuel storage tanks were lost as well. They had total station blackout. The only way to get around in there was with flashlights. That was what they had. There was a little bit of equipment, battery operated, but basically this is a total blackout. Okay, so as I said, the fission power was immediately stopped. After 1 hour, it's down to 1% of the original power. After 1 day, it's down to 0.5%. Now it's about 10 days later or so, it's down to about 0.3%. That's the fuel in the core. The fuel in the spent storage pits has been there at least 100 days or more. And so that's down to 0.1% power. It's still 0.1% of a large number is still a large number. So we have to still cool this fuel for at least 3 years in the water. And what I read of the reports, and I'm getting the same reports you do if you've been looking at the web, is that the concern now is with the fuel and the spent fuel pools, because it is open to the atmosphere. And any fuel damage, may get release of fission products. The only saving grace is that there isn't any iodine in the spent fuel pool because it's already been decayed away. There was a hydrogen reaction. This is just a chemical reaction within the reactors that caused hydrogen to build up, and it was vented to the building above the reactor, and that's what blew out the roofs of those buildings. So just a picture there of the situation. You can see that it was vented from the reactor into the upper area near the spent fuel pool, above the spent fuel pool, and blew off the roofs of 2, and put a big hole in the roof in another one. And we've seen this many times, explosion before and after. But the explosion, which I actually have never really seen the report, but it must have happened, there was the roof was destroyed, a big hole in the roof in Building 4, more than likely due to hydrogen explosion, due to failure of the fuel in the pit, in the spent fuel pit. There was no fuel in the reactor. The hydrogen could not have come from the reactor. It had to come from the spent fuel pool. So that was, well, that's a lesson to me. I shouldn't speak to my slides and not show you these slides. So this hydrogen explosion, Unit 4, indicated the spent fuel in the pools was failing, probably due to the falling water levels. This has been a major controversy in Japan because our NRC chairman, Dr. Jasko, said that that pool 4 was empty. Japan still insists that no, it's not. And Jasko recently has backed away from his statements, but he used that as a basis for his 50-kilometer or 50-mile exclusion zone around this reactor. So that's an ongoing sort of a sidelight, I guess you could say, to this. But the issue is that the spent fuel pools are a danger because when you uncover them, the fuel just heats up. This charcoal, this nuclear charcoal, is giving off heat, and it's going to give off heat for at least 3 more years at a level where you still need to cool it with water, and it can heat up and melt, and that means you'll damage the fuel, gaseous fission products in the fuel, which are long-lived. That is, the short-lived ones like the krypton and the iodine will decay away, but there are other ones that will not, and there are other fission products that could possibly escape. That's the source of the radiation danger. So you've seen this here. Unit 1 is on the right. Unit 2 has a hole in the side of the building, and that hole was actually, workers took that panel off to vent the hydrogen before the building would explode. So that's the reason for that vent there. And 3 and 4 the roofs are totally destroyed. The reactor in 4 has no fuel. It's only fuel in the spent storage pool. So how serious is this compared to previous accidents that we've had? Okay, so 3 Mile Island was nearly a full meltdown. Nearly 2/3 of the fuel melted. Most of the reactivity, though, it happened within the reactor, within the pressure vessel. 8 inches of steel, 8 or 10 inches of steel, surrounded by a containment. Neither one of these was breached. There was radiation release, but it was pretty minor. Chernobyl was an explosive dismantling of the reactor core due to a rapid increase in fission power. It caused a vapor explosion because this power was dumped into the water, and it immediately flashed the water to steam, and that blew a 1,000-ton reactor cover off the reactor. So it's important to realize Chernobyl was actually operating at the time of this accident. And this persisted for 10 days because there was 2,000 tons of graphite that caught on fire, and it was a perfect way to get fission products out of the fuel into the atmosphere. 40,000 feet up, where it could circulate around the world. This does not exist. This scenario does not exist for Fukushima. Not at all. We're not anywhere close to it. And I can't be too strong in saying that. Chernobyl had no containment to prevent release. There was very serious contamination, and the human toll was immense. But this is a singular accident that Fukushima is not close to being. There is a scale for ranking. Unfortunately, we have a scale for ranking nuclear accidents. This is an international scale. TMI is considered to be a 5. This means that it's an accident with wide consequences, wide meaning beyond the site of the reactor site. Fukushima is 5 so far. It may creep to a 6, but I kind of doubt it. Chernobyl is a 7. It probably deserves a 10. This is like a Richter scale of nuclear accidents. It's about a factor of 10. So like Chernobyl, in this case, Chernobyl would be a factor of 100 worse than 3 Mile Island. That, this is all judgment. We don't have a nuclear disaster meter out there that tells us what it is. It's the experts will say what it is. And right now it's a 5. It's probably going to stay around a 5 in my view. Yes, I did it again. Okay, so this is that international scale, and I won't repeat it, but it's one that everybody's using to rank the various accidents. Okay, the severity of the accident. The spent fuel pools are open to the atmosphere. That's bad. Well, but there's not a motive force like the 2,000 tons of burning graphite. That does not exist. There is zircaloy cladding in the fuel that can catch fire. It can be burned very hot, but it will go away. It won't last that long. So we see that it could distribute to fission products. It could be a significant release, but it's not going to be nothing at all, nothing even approaching Chernobyl. Getting the pools in a stable configuration would certainly help to keep this in the range of 3 Mile Island. The current status. The reactors have been stabilized with forced cooling, with seawater using fire engine pumps, and amazingly enough, when I heard this was a planned procedure 40 years ago. Glad that somebody remembered. But today I've seen news reports of fire in Unit 3, and I guess workers were evacuated for a while. The fact it's only for a while means the fire went out, and that is, it lost whatever it was combusting, and the radiation levels went back down. I don't think there's still been any significant radiation levels at the site boundary. There were a couple days ago, and I want to keep in mind that we will detect it if it's there. They detected a little bit of radioactive iodine in California, 1/1,000,000th of what it would be that you would need to be any issue at all. So the smallest amount of radiation, we will find it. It can't hide. We will find it. And there are lots of people looking for it, not just TEPCO, and in the case of 3 Mile Island, not just the NRC. Everybody's looking for it, and they can buy these instruments and they can see it. Electrical power is almost available. They've been working very hard. They've had to drag a whole new electrical system a mile to avoid the radiation areas, the contaminated areas. But they are hooked up. I think units 5 and 6 are already hooked up. The radiation levels are relatively small so far, still bad, but small. This will continue to be the case if the spent fuel pools and the reactors are adequately cooled. I see this as the end game. So what could happen? The best case scenario, and I would never imagine I would stand and say this, but the best case scenario is a 3 Mile Island accident. Because we're there already. We've failed fuel. We've had radiation emissions off-site. This, to me, is an accident with wide consequences. And that's why it is judged to be a 5 today. The worst case, but a credible one that you can actually hypothesize a reasonable set of physical events to happen, is a fire in the spent fuel pool. This is my colleagues in the department. That is, this could cause large release of radiation. It still would be a limited duration event and minor compared to Chernobyl, and it might then warrant a 6 on this scale. We don't want that. This is a worst case, but we don't think this is going to happen. The fuel is already damaged. There have been a couple fires already, or hydrogen explosions. We feel that the Japanese are very close to hooking up their pumps, using the electricity that's available to start cooling these. Once they're underwater, once this the spent fuel pool is filled, the radiation issues go away, except for whatever contamination is in the building itself, which is probably significant. In my judgment, the most likely outcome is that the reactor will continue to be cooled. The reactors appear to be stable. It's the pools are the issue. but I think they will also be able to handle those because they're very close to hooking up the electricity and running the pumps. So I'm guessing it'll be, well, I'm sure it'll be worse than 3 Mile Island, but it's going to be in the range of, there's a lot of room between a level 5 and a level 6, like an earthquake of 5 versus an earthquake of 6. There's a lot of room between those two, and I think it may remain a 5. And this is not a single person event. Our department has been very busy, as you might imagine, over the last 10 days. And a number of faculty have been involved, as well as a graduate student and a new faculty coming this year. So it's been a group effort, and as well as colleagues from around the world. And I appreciate their help as well. So thank you.
We'll be getting up the link to the nuclear engineering and radiology site that was up there on our CJS website as soon as we can. So for those of you who usually get to university information through CJS, the link to nuclear engineering will be there. May I remind the audience that we'll be taking questions off of 3x5 cards. So as you have questions, please write them down, and we will be collecting them shortly. Our last speaker today is Professor Jerome Ritsema, who holds the Henry Pollack Endowed Professorship of Geological Sciences here at the University of Michigan. He has expertise in geophysics and seismology. He researches earthquake rupture processes and seismic imaging of the Earth's interior. Professor Ritsema.
Wondering if I can take this off. Yeah. I wish the other speakers would have known this, right? So, yeah, I'm going to talk 10 minutes or so about the earthquake, mostly what the seismological perspective of this earthquake is. And I listed here the lessons that we've learned after a week of research, certainly not my work, but work of researchers around the world. The Japan earthquake, or the Tohoku Oki earthquake, was a large magnitude 9 earthquake, probably much larger than expected for Japan. This is the first earthquake of this magnitude recorded in instrumental history. Yet the tectonics and the earthquake process that we've seen is fairly well understood. There's no surprises here. The earthquake size and the tsunamigenic nature is also well understood and identified very early on in the analytical process. So the Pacific-wide tsunami that ensued from this earthquake had an expected amplitude and propagation time through the Pacific. More technical, more seismological aspects that we've learned of the earthquake, it ruptured a segment along the Japan Trench. Again, as I said, it's a bigger earthquake along this particular part of the Japan Trench than expected. Seismic risk there, and I'll explain this a little bit later, what we mean by that, was relatively low. The earthquake itself was extremely compact for a magnitude 9 earthquake. It ruptured a fault area that was relatively small, and it had a fault offset or a slip along the fault plane that was much larger than we've ever seen before. And some models suggest that there was more than 40 meters of slip involved in this earthquake, which is a phenomenal number until a week ago. A lot of the results that I'm presenting are not mine. They're really presented by discoveries from many researchers around the world, and I've really have had a lot of. Well, I've looked around websites all over the place to represent or to find some representative examples. Well, why earthquakes occur? Why is the Earth really active geologically? It's really a process of heat release in the Earth's interior. The very same heat that's causing these problems in Japan is the same heat that keeps the planet warm. Radiogenetic heat in the Earth's interior, as well as heat that was given to the Earth during its formation 4.5 billion years ago. That heat is escaping out of the Earth through a process that's essentially convection. So it's the Earth, the entire Earth is convecting as a hot system. And plate tectonics, the surface part of this convective area, is what gives us all these natural disasters. This is a cross-section, a schematic cross-section of the Pacific, so showing plate tectonics in the Pacific. And the Pacific plate is formed along the East Pacific Rise, which is a large chain of volcanoes, roughly 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers off the South American coast, where you're actually building tectonic plate, and these plates are moved both to the west and to the east. They're colliding with South America towards the east, they're colliding with Eurasia towards the west. And this particular earthquake was caused by this collision of the tectonic Pacific plate with Japan. Okay, so what happens in Japan is essentially the Pacific plate is sliding underneath the Eurasian plate by a process that we call subduction. And this collision zone itself is a very energetic and very, is a process that is not smooth, but that involves repeating earthquakes. This particular earthquake was right here, north of Tokyo, where the Pacific plate is sliding underneath the Eurasian plate along the Japan Trench. The collision between the two plates involves roughly a convergence of 8.3 centimeters per year. So every year, the Pacific plate is sliding towards Japan by roughly 8.3 centimeters or so. This is a north-northwest motion. That's exactly the same motion that we've seen in the earthquake itself. So the earthquake truly responds to this general north-northwest convergence. Earthquakes involve simply block motions along planar surfaces. Here I show you some examples of where you have earthquakes rupturing the surface. Here is an old picture, a famous picture of the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, where you see a fence being offset by roughly 6 meters. This, in fact, was an observation that led to the idea of planar motions of fault motions along planar surfaces. This is a more recent picture of an earthquake in Taiwan, the Chi earthquake in Taiwan, where you see that an earthquake here involved more or less vertical motions, and where a river is now, within this river you form a 6 meter high waterfall. Japan is also involved, the Japan earthquake also involved a similar type of slip motion. The Pacific crust, or the Pacific plate, is essentially descending underneath Japan, and with it dragging the Japanese crust with it over time. The Japan crust is essentially then bending like this, but kept together by large friction along this particular contact here beneath the Japanese crust. When you exceed the stress, when the stress of this contact exceeds the strength of the contact, the Japanese crust essentially pops back up. And that's what happened during the earthquake. During the earthquake, this part of the crust that was bent is then moved back up along an incline of roughly 14 degrees or so. This entire process was understood 25 minutes after the earthquake occurred. So basically by looking at seismological observations around the world, we understood within a half hour what has happened during the earthquake. Most important number that you see on this slide is this magnitude here. This is a moment magnitude 9 earthquake, meaning that involves a large amount of slip, a large amount of offsets over a very large fault zone. That was understood very quickly. What are these magnitudes? Well, magnitudes really gives us an idea of the spatial dimensions of earthquakes. So I'll give you 4 examples here. A magnitude -2 is an earthquake that occurs on a fault zone that's roughly the size of a quarter. A magnitude 2 is an earthquake that would rupture along a fault the length of the Michigan Stadium. A magnitude 6 would involve a plain as wide as Ann Arbor. A magnitude 9 is an earthquake 1,000 kilometers in length that would be the same distance as Ann Arbor to New York City. Magnitudes are also a very good measure of energy release. And if you look at, for example, the largest 10 earthquakes, or the largest 6 earthquakes rather, of the past century, those 6 earthquakes combined, those 6 magnitude 9 earthquakes combined, represents 50% of the total energy released by these earthquakes. 50% of the total amount of energy released of all earthquakes that have occurred during the last 100 years. So magnitude 9s are really truly the large earthquakes that count. Incidentally, 4 of those 10 earthquakes, or 4 of the large 10 earthquakes from the past century actually occurred in the last 7 years. Okay, this is a motion of the ground here in Ann Arbor due to the earthquake in Japan, and it again shows you how large this earthquake truly was. 45 minutes after the earthquake occurred, the major peak motions, the major ground motions here in Ann Arbor had an amplitude of roughly a centimeter. So the ground in Ann Arbor was moving up and down by roughly a centimeter. And that entire oscillation took about 2 minutes to complete. Okay. More closely in Japan, you also see the awesomeness of this earthquake. This earthquake, because of this sliding motion towards the east, motions on the coastal GPS sites of Japan moved roughly 3.6 meters or so. So due to the earthquake, Japan is now 3.6 meters wider. At the same time, the earthquake moved the coastal areas of Japan down by roughly a meter, and towards the south by roughly 2 meters. These are permanent displacements due to the earthquake. And all these measurements, all these GPS measurements, are entirely consistent with the geometry of faulting that we've seen seismologically from seismic waves around the world. The aftershock zone is roughly 400 meters in size. That's on the short side for a magnitude 9 earthquake, I think. Nonetheless, it's not unusual to see hundreds of kilometers of width and of length of fault areas of a magnitude this side. There's also interesting earthquakes that happened immediately after the earthquakes that were not on the fault plane. And for example, I've indicated here a bunch of earthquakes that are towards the east of the trench of these earthquakes. They're really located right here. They're probably related to bending of the slab, bending of the plate as it's going down. And this bending is essentially caused by the extra stresses caused by the earthquake further down dip. The interesting thing for a seismologist about this earthquake is it's finite spatial finiteness. It's a very compact earthquake compared to, for example, the magnitude 9 earthquake from Sumatra, which was similar in size. This plot here shows you what we call moment rate of the earthquake. It's essentially a measure of how much energy was pumped into the earth, how much seismic energy was put into the earth during the earthquake rupture. Okay? The earthquake rupture of the Sumatra earthquake was roughly 8 minutes in length. This Sumatra earthquake took 8 minutes to complete, but the release of this energy during this process is fairly gradual. The Japan earthquake, also magnitude 9, perhaps slightly smaller, but still a magnitude 9 earthquake, was completed in roughly 3 minutes. And it has an immensely large peak of energy release roughly 2 minutes after the rupture began. That's quite surprising of this earthquake, quite unusual for earthquakes. And what it really means is that there's really a spatial compactness, a spatial finiteness to this earthquake as well. The largest amount of slip due to this earthquake occurred in a relatively small patch on the fault plane, just directly east of the city of Sendai, right there. And the maximum amount of motions that you can have, or that we probably have had on this patch of fault plane, exceeded more than 40 meters, according to some of these models that are coming out right now. And this really explains very well the geodetic or the GPS type motions that we've seen along coastal Japan. Okay, of course, when you're slipping this block, this Japanese crust upwards, even though because this plane here is inclined, you're moving a massive amount of water. I did a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation. It's roughly 25 cubic kilometers of water that's being displaced by this earthquake. That, of course, is the cause of the large tsunami in Japan. The tsunami was estimated, or was also recorded by buoy stations, by deep ocean stations like these, deep ocean recorders of wave motions in the ocean. And in the deep ocean, it was measured that the tsunami height was roughly 90 centimeters or 1 meter or so, which is, again, given the magnitude of the earthquake, a number that is well understood. Also well understood is how this tsunami would have propagated through the deep ocean. The deep ocean tsunami itself was roughly a meter in height. It could, of course, grow as the tsunami waves hit the coastlines. but a meter-high tsunami that is predicted by seismologists, given their estimates of moment, given estimates of magnitude and spatial finiteness, is very consistent with what we observed. So is, of course, the propagation speed of the tsunamis, which is also well understood. Tsunamis propagate through the ocean by roughly the speed of an airliner. So coastal areas far away from Japan have ample time to respond to a tsunami. Something about the hazard. This earthquake was much larger than expected. Also ruptured a part of the Japanese trench that was not expected to break in large earthquakes. Global seismic hazard is essentially based on earthquakes, where we have had earthquakes. If you have earthquakes in a certain place, we have large hazard. That's sort of the process by which we estimate hazard. So the top here is a map of earthquakes, 360,000 earthquakes that have occurred in the last 50 years. And based on this map, we're building a global seismic hazard map that essentially just represents seismicity in the world. And that's the same in Japan in more detail. This was the hazard map for Japan compiled in 2001. And this hazard map has a lot of detail, but it seems to suggest that the largest risk here is in southern Japan, south of Tokyo, along the Nangai Trough right there. And it's essentially based on where we've had previous earthquakes, previous large earthquakes along this collision zone. There is some risk. There was actually in these maps, there is some risk reported for Sendai, and that was essentially based on earthquakes that have occurred in the region right here. But most earthquakes in the particular region where this large earthquake occurred have always been on the order of magnitude 7, 7.5, repeating every 40 years or so. But we've never had a report of a much larger earthquake in this particular area. I'm comparing this map now to the observed accelerations, the observed ground motions due to the earthquake. And you see that, in fact, where seismic risk may have been believed to be low is where we've actually had peak accelerations exceeding 1 gravity, 1 g. So very large, indeed very large ground accelerations. That is what causes a lot of the damage in the area. I'm finishing off with a slide or 2 slides actually on the US. This whole scenario, this whole process that happened in Japan is something that will happen also in the United States. I can't tell you when, but it will happen. It has happened in the past. Subduction or collision between oceanic plate and continental plate is occurring as we speak in the Pacific Northwest. Anywhere south of Oregon, or the Oregon-California border, all the way up to Vancouver Island, there is a large plate of Pacific lithosphere that is sliding underneath the United States. And large earthquake, magnitude 9 earthquakes have indeed occurred in this area. The last one was in 1700. And here's a table of estimated times of large earthquakes in this area based on geological evidence of tsunami deposits that have been recorded in deposits inland. The large earthquake was in 1700. The earthquake before that was in 1310, etc., etc. The repeat time of earthquakes in this particular area is in the order of 400 to 500 years. So sometime in the not so far future, we can expect a magnitude 9 earthquake also to affect the United States. Thank you very much.
I've asked Ken if I can speak out of turn because the comments that have just been concluded lead directly into something I had hoped to talk about. There was an earthquake in 1700 estimated magnitude of 8.9 to 9.2 that occurred in exactly the region that we've just been talking about. That tsunami hit Japan. And there is a book that deals with this that's worth taking a look at. It's called The Orphan Tsunami of 1700. And the area where it hit was precisely the Tohoku area that is where what we're talking about right now. Damage there was, at least in contemporary terms, at least as great as what we're talking about here. But that tsunami was one that the Japanese had no earthquake beforehand. They sensed no earthquake beforehand. It came as a complete surprise, but it's dealing with exactly the issues that are just raised here. And in fact, Brian Atwater and his colleagues who wrote this particular book wrote it not because they were interested in Japan, but because they're interested in giving evidence of precisely the risk we're just talking about here.
We'll now take questions from the audience. May I ask you to pass any questions that you might have to CJS staff that are in the aisles. While those are being collected, I have one initial question, which is that, and this is addressed to a number of people, perhaps Professor Kage, Abir, and Brown, and to our scientists as well, which is that what we've seen is that historically Japan has been prone to earthquakes, and it's a country that is thought to have invested a great deal in disaster preparedness. Yet the losses were great, and the response to some of us who have been watching the media have seemed really, really slow. So is there something about this particular situation that led to the large losses and the slow responses, or especially in terms of the slow response, is there something going on here about the relationship of the government to the area, or the coordination of government and nonprofit organizations in providing relief?
I'd like to take a stab at that question. And I guess I think there's two things going on here. First, there's just a sheer geographical scope of the disaster in this latest earthquake seems to be much larger than the earthquakes that Japan has seen in the past. And just the fact that the disaster hit areas are just so spread out, in addition to the damage to the crucial infrastructure such as railroads, highways, and communications really seems to be slowing down the relief efforts. But the other thing that is going on, I think, is that Japan is dealing with not one but two crises at the same time, and this nuclear incident, as well as is dealing with the tsunami and earthquake victims, and the government seems to have been focusing more on the ongoing crisis, the nuclear crisis, rather than the disaster from the tsunami and earthquake victims per se, and perhaps, I mean, it's a tough call, but perhaps rightly so, trying to get the nuclear situation under control. So I think in cases like this, I know that the Japanese government has been criticized for its slowness in responding to this present situation, but I think it's really given the gravity of the task and the severity of the situation, it's really hard to say whether it has been slow or fast or what, because I don't think many governments in history have had to deal with this kind of crisis in the past. But I'd also be interested to hear what Professor Brown has to say.
No, I think Professor Kage's comments here are really critical. If you look at the improvements in preparation that came after the Kobe earthquake that have been very useful in my historical research. One of them is to set up hazard maps. I mean, there's a boom in presenting hazard maps, but hazard maps are created on certain assumptions about what kinds of threats are likely. And they're based on past experience. They're based on in that sense, on precisely the kinds of density and severity of earthquakes that were just graphed in our last presentation. But also for floods, for risk of volcanic activity and similar kinds of things. They provide guidance as to where to flee, what roads are likely to be damaged. But in terms of most of these hazard maps, they're done at a municipal level, not at a regional level, at least those that I've seen. And to deal with the kinds of disasters we're talking about here requires a regional kind of projection and coordination. The major rail lines have been wiped out along these areas. Roads are gone. They're covered by landslides. Our news media has done a poor job of covering the impact of landslides. Even though they're not large in terms of area, they cut off transportation and make access to any of these damaged places really very, very difficult. There was one brief report of a dam that actually collapsed as a result, but there are probably dozens of dams that have been damaged by this and that have some kind of risk of collapse and causing additional flooding and additional damage. The geographic scope here is critical. The magnitude of the tsunami, even where things survived the earthquake, the magnitude of the tsunami itself has created tremendous complications. The earthquake has created tremendous complications because of landslides. This was really unprecedented and people thought unimaginable. But it's, again, precisely the reason why people like Brian Atwater are trying to go back into history and show examples of things like this that actually do happen so people think ahead a bit more seriously.
Just one more comment from the disaster management perspective. As far as disaster preparedness is concerned, Japan really leads the way. There are many, many disaster experts. Their disaster plan is as good as they come, which indicates how concerning this scenario is, meaning that any disaster plan is only as good as the size of the disaster that it's responding to. So, and there's only so much we can learn from previous disasters. So this is just the slowness in responding to this disaster as far as the Japanese government is concerned, I believe is just an indication of the sheer size and the complexity of the events. And it just tells us, I think, in the US to be actually more aggressive and vigilant in disaster preparedness, because again, if a place like Japan that is that prepared is suffering these consequences, then we should this should be a red flag for us.
I have a number of related questions for Professor Ritsima. Does the historical study of earthquakes suggest another high-intensity earthquake is more or less likely to occur in the same geographic region before the results of this quake are resolved? So is another earthquake likely to occur in the Fukushima Sendai area? And then a similar question, but in reference to another area of Japan. Does the Tohoku quake affect the likelihood of the Tokai Nankai quake that's forecast in the Shizuoka Aichi areas?
Yeah, actually, it gets a little bit out of my area of expertise. So I'm if earthquakes occur in break certain parts of the contact, we expect that stress is relieved and buildup has to occur again over time in order for the next earthquake to occur. The problem always with earthquake prediction is, are we sure that the stress has been fully relieved? Has the stress completely released on the fault plane? Now, for magnitude 9 earthquakes, that's certainly very likely, and magnitude 9 earthquakes rarely happen within 100 years or so in the very same area of, for example, Japan. It's very unlikely that another earthquake would occur the area, say, within the next 100 years. But I'm very careful here, but that's unlikely. What the earthquake, how this affects, for example, the area further to the south, well, again, it depends a lot on whether this earthquake has changed the stress levels on the southern part, on the Nankai Trough part. I can't say for sure. It's a different segment of the slab. The geometry is quite complex, so I can't quite be certain of that. It certainly does not. One thing is for sure. It does not has lowered the risk of earthquakes there. That's for sure. Whether it has increased the risk, that's not quite clear to me.
Thank you. I have a number of related questions for Professor Martin. Please describe in a bit more detail the nuclear reactor shutdown process. I understand that control rods are inserted, but are fuel rods also withdrawn and moved to pools?
No, the fuel is stationary in a reactor. The control rods actually come from the bottom in this design. They get pushed up into the core. They're large cruciform, about a cruciform of this cross-section, thick plates that are pushed up into the core between the fuel, and it shuts down the reactor immediately.
Continuing for Professor Martin, could you please speak to the additional dangers of Fukushima due to the presence of MOX fuel, MOX fuel, and how long and how wide an area will be off limits as a result of the nuclear disaster?
Okay, so MOX fuel means mixed oxide fuel, and this is a mixture of plutonium fuel and uranium fuel. All reactors have plutonium in them. Towards the end of life, half of the fuel in the reactor is actually plutonium generated while it's running, so it's in there. MOX fuels means that the Japanese have reprocessed the spent fuel and separated out the plutonium and uranium isotopes that are valuable, and then put them back into new fuel rods, fabricate 2 new fuel rods, and have a mixture of uranium and plutonium fuel in them. So one of the reactors has MOX fuel in it. I don't know which one. And this, actually, the radiological consequences of this are negligible unless somehow you vaporize the fuel and it goes up into the air. That mechanism does not exist for Fukushima. Chernobyl had this 2,000 tons of graphite, which does not exist in our reactors. 2,000 tons of graphite on fire at a 2,500 degrees centigrade fire. This vaporized a percentage of the fuel, not a huge amount, but quite a bit. So MOX fuel would have certainly added to the radiological consequences in that case, but it would have basically no effect in the case of Fukushima.
Okay.
You had a second question, which is, I think the question was probably, would the exclusion zone be bigger? And I would say no, if that was your question.
Mm-hmm. A question for Professor Kage. To restore their lives, quake victims need cash. Whatever happens to the survivors, financial resources, banking records, documentation. Do we have an idea of what might be going on there?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? What happened to the...
To restore their lives, quake victims need cash.
Sure.
Whatever happened or whatever happens to the survivors' financial resources, banking records, documentation. And if you know what happened during Kobe, this might be something to answer
Right.
historically.
I know that both in the case of Kobe and in this present crisis, banks are essentially, I think essentially they are handing out cash to residents in the disaster hit areas, and I think they are, as long as you bring an ID, which may pose a challenge for many of these people, banks are giving out up to 100,000 yen. Which is roughly the equivalent of about $1,200. But that's just in the immediate post-earthquake situation. So I must say I'm not entirely clear about what was done in the Kobe situation. I know that the disaster victims were given low-interest loans and also subsidies to help them rebuild their houses, but I would have to check on the bank records.
Okay. Thank you. A question for Professor Brown. You mentioned that solutions sometimes cause problems. Would you please explain this?
The reference here is to the role in which flood control facilities that I talked about help increase other kinds of risks, or in some ways mask risks. With the Okotsu diversion channel, the risk that people always had debated since the project was originally proposed in around 1720 was whether or not it would, in a disaster situation, cause greater hardship than the benefit that it incurred. And when that weir collapsed that I showed you, that was seen by many of these people to be proof positive that all of their fears were in fact borne out in practice. But by narrowing the Shinano's riverbed, by populating the former floodplain with new buildings and with new residential areas, people had a kind of false sense of security that the new dikes provided, and in fact have on a number of occasions been caught in floods as a result of this. One of the best ways that I can think of to demonstrate this is to think of the way in which people rename locations that local residents used to think of as completely uninhabitable. The slide of the floods that I showed you for Nagaoka is a key example. Those areas have been built up by developers as part of suburbanization. New dikes were put in. People, developers came in, bought up the land, sold it to people who didn't know anything about local conditions, saying, oh, we have the new dikes in, they're perfectly safe, everything is fine. No local resident would ever buy property there, no matter what happened with the dikes. And those areas were precisely the areas in 2004 that got flooded and where there was the biggest loss. There are a number of instances in which building a dike changes the hydrological forces on a river, and dikes that had served perfectly well for 300 years in 2004 collapsed because the dynamics of the river flow were changed. So in all of these ways, plus adding to subsidence and this kind of sinking of the Niigata area, all of these are side effects related to attempts to solve the problems of flood control. So those are the examples I'd give just offhand.
A question for Dr. Abir. Why can't people be evacuated to other areas of the country, especially from the hospitals? Surely Japan has great medical capacity elsewhere.
Sure. So I can speak about Katrina and kind of find parallels here with the current situation. So the problem becomes when an actual health facility is part of the disaster itself. Transport of patients, oftentimes very sick patients, from facility to facility is not an easy matter. Part of it is a logistic issue of actually having the resources to transport people from one hospital to another. The other becomes the risk of actually transporting sick patients and the kind of morbidity and mortality associated with that. So even outside of the situation of disasters, transferring patients from one facility to another has risks and implications on the outcomes for the patients. And specifically during disaster situations, that's even more grave. So it's not a light matter. And I can't imagine that in Japan, the situation, and from what I've read and I gather, that it was a similar situation, so that the kind of resources required to transfer patients were lacking initially. And the issue then becomes actually what resources do you have in a hospital itself to take care of patients for any duration of time. So as with Katrina in Japan, the issue of water, the issue of sanitation, the issue of food, enough medical resources became a problem. And in the United States, hospitals, even pre-Katrina, oftentimes have measures to account for situations where basically they can't leave, patients can't leave, no resources can come in. And since Katrina, there has been an effort to actually in the United States to prepare hospitals for situations such as that, and also have very intact evacuation plans. However, again, I mean, it's an issue of the size of the disaster, how broken down the infrastructure is, and whether you can get people out and bring stuff in.
If I could add a few, just one point. I have seen that hospital patients who were hospitalized in the disaster areas have actually been transported out of the areas, and hospitals in Tokyo and in the Kansai area, for instance, have been taking in patients. I think there are actually websites up for hospitals around the country to post how many patients they can take and in which areas, and they've been trying to coordinate the transportation of patients to different parts of the country.
I have a number of related questions for Professor Martin. As you know, U of M's study abroad students have been taken out of Japan at this point. But these questions have to do whether the students might eventually return, and if so, when. In the event of the worst case scenario, if you were an exchange student in Tokyo, would you return to Tokyo in May to start the second semester? Similar question. With the scale rating that you've given us of 5, would you encourage a family member to evacuate from Tokyo? How about Hawaii? Any threats to the West toward Korea?
Okay, for the exchange student, I would certainly wait, and I would not return until I could see what the radiological consequences were. As I said, it will be detected. We will know quantitatively what the levels are. We'll know what's safe and what isn't safe. So that is going to start as this accident, as it unfolds, as I think it will, which is going to hopefully, and we don't know, but I think it will enter the 3 Mile Island endgame of a slow cooling of the fuel. But we're talking about spent fuel as well. But it's a matter of getting the pumps going and the water moving, and I think that should be possible. In that case, I don't envision any further releases on the scale, at least of the first couple releases that we had, and it's probably going to be fine to go back. As far as somebody living in Tokyo, whether it was a family member or not, I would certainly not recommend that they leave the area. Again, because the information is going to be there, and there's going to be multiple agencies corroborating the information about the radiation levels, and we will detect it. Don't think we can't detect it. We can. If we can't detect it, your body can't either.
A question for Dr. Rissima. Did the earthquake in Christchurch trigger or affect the Japan quake? So is there any relationship of New Zealand and Tohoku?
The only relationship that I can think of is that they're both occurring on a collision zone between the Pacific plate and the surrounding plates. So both are tectonically speaking fairly well understood why they occurred. Whether they're related, in that sense they're related. They're both plate tectonic boundary processes. But whether one caused the other, that's really speculation. There's absolutely no indication that earthquakes, or at least we have not seen patterns in earthquakes that suggest that earthquakes that far apart, thousands of kilometers apart, are really affecting one another. There are, however, observations of earthquakes that do trigger local earthquakes or local activity nearby. But over these large distances, it's hard to imagine that it's the case.
Okay. So a question for Professor Kage in relation to her slide 10, which showed Sendai as being considerably poorer than the Kobe area. The question is, might Sendai's poverty be more pronounced compared to Kobe when inflation is taken into account?
There hasn't been very much inflation in Japan in the last 20 years. What has happened is more deflation than inflation, and that has really been occurring around the country. So it is possible that the numbers are somewhat inflated, but they would not be they'd be inflated to around the same levels in both cities. So in a relative scale, I think Sendai's poverty is still poorer than Kobe, and in the magnitude that was seen on the slides.
This is a question for Dr. Martin. When you mentioned that the U.S. has sent assistance to the control of the nuclear reactors, what can the U.S. send to help? Surely Japan has high levels of expertise in this area.
I don't think I mentioned that we have, but what I mentioned was the Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner, the chairman of the commission, evidently went to Japan. When he came back, he told Congress that Unit 4's pool was empty. So that's, he's certainly not a nuclear expert. There have been 15 or 20 nuclear experts from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did go to Japan, and probably an equal number of experts from Department of Energy, the national labs as well. Although I'm just speculating there. I just heard a number like 30 or 40, and I'm not sure who went. I don't know anybody I only know one person has gone. So what they're providing is simply advice. It's certainly true the Japanese have a very mature industry. They've designed and built these reactors. They know them. They live with them. On the other hand, the U.S. has gone through the 3 Mile Island accident. That's not unlike, the progression of it is not unlike the Fukushima accidents. Both are caused by loss of coolant. Both are involving fuel damage. So they're being prudent in trying to seek advice from any source they can. The worst thing you can do is stay isolated, think you know all the answers, and whereas there may be some good other ideas out there that you can listen to and assess and act accordingly.
Thank you again to the panelists for helping us to understand a little better what's unfolding in Japan. We've certainly seen that the events of the last 10 days are events that need to be understood from many, many perspectives. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. I know I speak for all of us when I say that our presence here today expresses our sympathy and concern for those affected by the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear disaster. This concludes our panel for today.